everybody. This is Mahadeva. All right, so when I'm wrong, I am man enough to admit it. And I may have been wrong about many of the things that I was very vocal about in terms of the origins of the Indo-European peoples. So, according to when I was in college, there was the Aryan invasion theory. And it was based mainly off, there wasn't really a whole lot of science to it. It was basically off of linguistic projections. So even the word Indo-European, although now have, with the information that we have now, is actually a pretty accurate name. That name came out of actually racist understanding. So back in the 1700s, I believe it was, you had British imperialists who went down into India, and as you know, they eventually, annexed India, conquered it, and colonized it, and it was one of the British colonies. And when the British were down there, they became aware that the East Indian language, Hindi, and the language of the sacred Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, the Sanskrit language, which was, the precursor to to the Hindi languages. These British scholars came to the awareness that, hey, this sounds a heck of a lot like Latin and Greek, and this could be a European language. It's so similar. They came to realize it was the same language. And so by studying that, they came to the conclusion that people from Europe had come down into India and conquered it, and they brought with them that language. And of course, you read the Vedas, and the Vedas are very clear that the Aryans, which means the noble ones, these people came down from the steppes of Russia down into what is now Iran, and to the upper parts of what is now Pakistan, but used to be India, and they made their way down into India. And it's very clear, if you read the Vedas, it's very clear. So these British colonists came up with the conclusion that, here's what happened. A bunch of blonde-haired, blue-eyed European people came down and conquered India. And so then now that in and of itself, there's really nothing wrong with that. Those kinds of things happen all the time and have happened throughout history. But the problem was that attached to that, they used that theory to further promote their racist ideology, that the British people, white people, were superior to the dark-skinned East Indians. And so it was used as a way to oppress another culture. So you can understand, after hundreds of years of that, the peoples of India they rebelled against that, as anybody would, and they didn't like being told that their native religion and that their language and that their culture was actually European, and that they themselves, even though they carried this Indo-European tradition, the feeling was that they really didn't deserve it, that us white people, this is really ours. And so you can understand that they had an opposite reaction. So then there arose the out of India theory, which a lot of people still, if you look for it, especially European people who practice East Indian cultural traditions, they will vociferously, and I understand why they do it, vociferously put out this belief that that the European nation was actually populated by Indian people, not the other way around. Well, as it turns out, that's really not the case at all. So when you look at the science of that, the genetics paints a completely different picture. That the genetics of the modern people in India are an admixture of a bunch of different ethnicities. And so what the Vedic tradition teaches, which is that the Aryans came from the north and swept down into India and conquered it and intermixed with the people that were there, which they called the Dravidians. The Dravidians would have been the dark-skinned people which had a strong association with Africa, actually. So you see this in like the Andaman Islands, and you go further south in India, the skins get darker and darker, and the hair gets curlier and curlier. And so, there's nothing wrong with that fact. We had people come in, whether through conquest or whether through peaceful intermingling, you have this mingling of different ethnicities, but they held on to their Indo-European roots. So that Vedic religion then morphed into the Hindu religion. And as I've said, and I will continue to say it, that the Hindu people are the only Indo-European descended people who still practice the original Indo-European religion that stretches back into infinity. Yes, it has evolved, but it's still essentially the same. They still hold on to the Vedas. So if you really want to understand Indo-European, an unbroken connection into Indo-European religion, the Hindu religion is the best place to go. Now, you can of course read the Vedas, you can of course look at historical artifacts, but then you're left imposing your own projections and guesses onto it, which is what modern day heathens do with both the Celtic and the Germanic. They impose their own post-Christian understanding of it. And my take on the majority of heathen religions, some of the heathen scholarly stuff is pretty good, but in terms of what the religion meant and how you view the gods and interact with the gods, my personal experience is that modern day heathens really are just projecting two-dimensional Christian ideas, and they're just replacing Jesus with Thor and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, that was what I was taught in college, and I bristled at that. I didn't like that. I still don't like that idea. Especially don't like the exclusion and the racism associated with it. But as you can see, my friend over here to my right, this is from about 5,000 years ago in the steppes of Russia. And he was a member of what we now call the Yamnaya, Yamnaya, the Yamnaya culture. And the reason why I picked that particular picture is if you see what is there, it looks sort of like a cricket bat that you see there in his left hand, cradled in his left, the crook of his left elbow, is this thing that looks kind of like a skinny cricket bat. It's made out of bronze, and it's actually a weapon. And it's like, I use the word cricket bat for a reason. Of course, it's skinnier than that, but it's flat, and it's a two-edged thing that's flat on both sides. It has dull edges, so it's got thick edges. It's not a sword. It's a club. It's a bronze club. And the reason why I put that there is because that weapon corresponds almost exactly to the Vedic description of Indra's Vajra, or his lightning bolt that he carries with him. So this would also be similar to Thor's hammer, same kind of thing. So what I didn't like, and I still don't like, about the Aryan invasion hypothesis, what I didn't like about that is I obviously didn't like the idea of, this is I'm sharing with you my agenda. Everybody has an agenda, and it's okay as long as you're conscious of it. And it's also okay if you're aware that your agenda is your agenda, and just because you're emotionally attached to it, that doesn't mean that it's the truth. As much as I want it to be the truth, I'm far more interested in the actual truth. And I'm self empowered and individuated enough in myself that it's okay with me that if my ancestors did things that I don't like, it doesn't mean that that reflects on me personally. So I'm open to change my ideas. But my agenda worked really well with another theory that, if you read my books and hear me talk about, I talk about this a lot, and sometimes very passionately. And that is the Paleolithic continuity paradigm, which still has a lot of scientific validity to it. So there's probably a mixture of the two when it comes to reality, because the truth is, reality is never just one thing. It's usually a combination of things. But the Paleolithic continuity paradigm says that there wasn't this Aryan migration where 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, during the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, that there wasn't this wave of Aryan-speaking Indo-European horse warriors coming down out of the steppes and sweeping through all of the northern hemisphere and conquering people and replacing their language or imposing their language on top of the indigenous hunter-gatherers. I really didn't like that. I didn't like it, when I first was taught it back in, the 80s. And I still don't like the idea now. Personally, I don't like that idea. And the reason that I rejected it is because that, the theory as it was taught was based in a bunch of assumptions that are now turning out to be actually fairly accurate. But, there wasn't a whole lot of science behind it, and there was a lot of unconscious racist agenda that was driving it, which is why I completely understand why native East Indians would propose the opposite, that no, you Europeans are descended from us, not the other way around. Well, the truth is that neither of those things are true. Because the archaeology and the genetics, now we're getting more and more into the genetics of it, we're seeing that the genetic reality is that there's a lot of truth to this. However, we need to take out the European racist agenda out of it in order to get a more accurate picture. So the Nazis, they loved this idea, and as you know, they, by the way, the Nazis did not appropriate the swastika. The swastika, that is the Vedic name for that symbol. But the Europeans had the same symbol, but they called it the filfot. And it had the same meaning. It was the thunder wheel. It was a moving wheel in the sky of the sun, but it was also strongly associated with the thunder god, who was the defender of human beings against evil and negativity and all of that. So the Nazis appropriated it and turned it into some kind of racial symbol, which of course is nonsensical. But Yeah, so the Nazis loved that, and they imposed an ethnic aspect to it, which is not reflected in the science, which is that blonde-haired, blue-eyed people uh, came out of the German area and flooded, all that kind of stuff, and so that's nonsense. But what we do know is that in the steppes of Russia, so if you're not familiar with geography, let me just waggle my finger at you in shame, because you should be able to see in your mind like I do. I can see a map in my head, and I can see exactly where the steppes of Russia are. So I know exactly where in the world I'm talking about when I say the steppes of Russia, of modern day Russia. So there was a people that developed um, a very turned out to be extremely influential culture that came out of that region. And if you talk to a racist European, they will say, "Oh, these were blonde-haired, blue-eyed horse warriors," which is not entirely true. The DNA of this gentleman right here indicates that actually he had probably had light olive skin, and he had dark hair and dark eyes. Now, they probably had very mixtures of that. They probably had lighter brown hair and red hair, because, of course, the lightning god has red hair. And although that doesn't mean anything, because the lightning gods, the thunder gods in China also have red hair, and Chinese people don't have red hair. So it doesn't necessarily point to something in their genetics, but it could point to that. And so what it looks like is that these horse warriors who carried a vajra, which this guy has a vajra, they swept down in all directions. When they mastered horse riding and the wheel and war chariots and things like that, they had found a technology that was not widely used. And so they did, in fact, it looks like, based on the actual genetic evidence, and the linguistics does tend to support this, that around, starting around 5,000 years ago, 4,000, 3,000, not 3,000, yeah, 5,000, 4,000 years ago, they started sweeping down into all parts of the northern hemisphere in all directions. They even went so far as in China, very similar as their homeland, a steppe kind of scenario, but all the way over in China, the Tocharian people. And the history of them is very interesting. How is it that these horse warriors, these pastoralists, how did they end up conquering, and still to this day strongly influencing and controlling much of the known world at the time? They did that because their first beast of burden that they took in and started domesticating were horses, not cattle, but horses. And in the beginning, horses were used the way cows were used. Horses were taken, domesticated, and raised and used for meat and milk. So the original, what we now, everybody, and this has been going on for a long time, Indo-Europeans especially, worship the cow and cow's milk, and they even developed, genetically developed the ability to digest cow's milk, which a lot of people can't. I mean, I'm not lactose intolerant, but if I drink a lot of milk, which I don't anymore, but if I did, I get cheese and all that stuff. We're not really built for it. But I guess maybe horse milk, we were. So they domesticated horses and used them for meat and milk, and then started continuing to breed out the wildness of these wild horses, and created this domesticated style of horse that we have today, which you could then ride. So riding horses was not the first thing that they did. They first used horses for other means, and then they discovered, hey, you can sit on the backs of these things, and then you can get to go long distances, and then of course that gave them an advantage when it came to warfare, because then you're faster, you're above your opponent, and you can wield something like this, a vajra, as you're going through, clubbing your way through your enemies that you're either defending yourself from or conquering. And then along with that, they had also developed, of course, the wheel and the wagon, which is not unique to them, but they then learned how to combine horses and wagons in war chariots and turn it into warfare, which of course they are not the only peoples to have done that. But they became very proficient at that. And so at the end of the Stone Age, these guys who are now using this emerging technology of bronze, along with their understanding of horses and riding horses and all that, they sweep down into everywhere. Now, if I'm accurate in this, I believe also that there was a climate shift, which may have changed their lifestyle up on the steppes. It may have become less and less workable for them to have their giant pastoral, farms and all of that. So all these things come together, and these people do. So I'm here telling you that it's very likely I was wrong about that. That in fact, the Indo-European language, culture, and religion starts with these guys. Interestingly enough, this guy here seems to be built very similar to me. He's about my height, and broad shoulders, and according to looking at the bones, he seemed to have been well built muscularly. His arms were a little longer than normal, which mine are a little longer than normal, but he's about my height. And it also seems pretty clear that he was a horse rider, because there seems to be some compression of the discs in the lower back, which is common with people who are constantly riding horses all the time. So as much as I didn't like the idea, and I still don't like the idea that my ancestors were conquering people who swept in and colonized other places and imposed their language and culture and religion on others, it seems to be that's pretty much the case. And what you find is that at the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of the Bronze Age, that there's these repeated migrations, if you want to call them migrations. They probably started out that way. The truth is they probably started out as migrations and intermixing, and then people started adopting their superior technology, horses and wagons and bronze, etc. And so you had, which is really kind of what happens now, and then people, of course, there was intermarriage involved, and if they had, economically, if they had, more means, then people are going to be more likely to adopt their ways and, copy them. When you have paternal society like the Indo-Europeans were, then what's going to happen is the male is going to marry some indigenous woman, and it is going to be understood that she is going to convert to his religion. She's going to be his wife, and his child will take on his name and will be initiated into the ancestral gods and the ancestors. He will take on the lineage, which means the ancestors of his paternal line, because that's how patrilineage works. And so even though the child will be, half Yamnaya warrior and half whatever else, he will identify 100% with his father and his father's religion, etc., etc. So I still think that the Indo-European religion is specifically like the Celtic and the Germanic religions are not this admixture of maternal earth, shamanic versus this paternal, deity-oriented. I think that theory is nonsense. I think what happened is exactly what it looks like what happened. That this culture and this language, either through influence, successfulness, and or through warfare and conquest, was in fact went in and replaced whatever was there beforehand. But that's why, when one of the things I said, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed thing did not come from these guys. These guys were not blonde-haired and blue-eyed. They obviously, if you look at his skull, he's got very similar features that I may have, the sharp nose, etc., etc. But blonde hair and blue eyes was not something that they were huge in. And it looks like the indigenous hunter-gatherers, especially in the northern parts in Scandinavia, etc., that there was a lot of blonde-haired, blue-eyed indigenous people there. So that's why the further west you go, northwest, the more blonde and blue-eyed people become. I think that's probably why. Again, I'm just now making observations, but I've read that's kind of where that came from. So let's get rid of the idea that these guys were blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. They weren't. Let's get rid of that racist nonsense that the Aryans were blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. They obviously didn't look like the people in southern India. They didn't look like the Andaman people whom they intermixed with to end up with modern Indian features, very dark skin, but at the same time very European features in some of the Hindu societies. But it's that explains why you look at the Proto-Germanic language, you look at the Latin language, you look at the Greek language, and you look at the Sanskrit language, and they are virtually identical. For instance, the word for horse, which would have been extremely important, was in Latin, it's equus, E-Q-U-U-S. The U-S is a nominative ending. Equus. In the Germanic, you have the rune ehwaj. So it's the same language, different pronunciation. Equus, ehwaj. And you have, of course, I've gone through all of the deities are the same in all of these traditions. So there's some background there. And as I can no longer hold on to my personal pet theory, which I was holding on to for so long, which is that, the Indo-Europeans came up from Africa and their language and culture has stayed the same for 50,000 years. Fortunately, as wonderful as I like that, tends not to be true. Now, I happen to have dark hair, like you can't tell now, but when I had hair, my hair was black. It was jet black. And I had green eyes, but I had fair skin. My father actually was very dark-skinned. He had olive skin, and he was 100%, his last name Denny means Danish. I mean, he's descended from Vikings. I'm sure there's a bunch of other stuff in there as well, Northern European stuff thrown in there as well. But I definitely don't fall into the typical category of the Indo-European racial stereotype: blonde hair, blue-eyed, tall. I'm not tall. I'm the same height as this guy. So maybe he was tall for his day and age, but I'm little shorter than average, but I'm stocky. And who knows where the hell that came from. Anyway, so, but I find all that interesting, and I really find it interesting that he actually, instead of wearing a thunder hammer around his neck like I do, he actually carried a vajra. He carried a lightning bolt with him. So bear in mind that that's bronze. So he would have polished that. It would have glinted in the sun as he's riding his horse, swinging his vajra around. It would have been, especially for people who weren't, who didn't have bronze, it would have been a frightening thing. If they didn't have horses and they didn't have bronze, there's this guy coming through with this shining, gleaming, lightning bolt in his hand as he's, taking out all of the warriors that he's conquering. So there you go. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but just kind of wanted to say that. And please don't leave any ridiculous racist comments. I mean, I may not even allow comments because I know a lot of racist idiots are going to come on and say some nonsense. And I'm not going to co-sign that. Anyway, but there you go. So feel free to read all of my books and watch all of my other videos. And bear in mind that you now can see that I was operating from my agenda, and that my agenda did have an influence on my thinking. And being the good critical thinker that I am, I'm now the evidence is overwhelming. I can no longer fight against the evidence that my ancestors very well were exactly what you might think. They were, they were conquering warriors that came in and, colonized and conquered pretty much everywhere that they went. And to this day, pretty much the majority of all of the languages and cultures in Europe are a result of this influx of these steppe pastoralist horse warriors that came in. And, they came from, again, the steppes of Russia, and they went in all directions, but especially they came down into Northwest Europe and then all the way down into Iberia and down into Italy and down into Greece and down into Anatolia and into the subcontinent of Asia, specifically in India. They had huge influence on our society up till this day. English is the dominant language in most of the world, and that is a direct result of this guy coming in with his vajra, marrying the indigenous women and conquering and or killing the indigenous males, and then imposing his language and his culture onto whomever he came in contact with. So, like it or not, those are the facts. And now, without any prejudice, I reveal to you what seems to be the cutting edge in all of science. So now, when we can look back on ancient Proto-Germanic words, and now we can see a stronger connection. We can see that the Germanic deities and the language that I love comparing with the Vedic is actually, we're talking about, these are pretty much the same guys, and it was happening around the same time. And in fact, it still is true that the Germanic language and religion is still closer to the original Indo-European than, the Greek, for example. And the Vedic and the Germanic still are very closely connected, even though nowadays you have the Hindu religion and you have the ancient Germanic religion. You have a pretty huge divide in terms of racial background. that the racial makeup of the East Indians and the racial makeup of the Germanics are very different. But they still hold the same language, culture, and religion that goes back, who knows how long, but at least goes back 5,000 years or more. All right, that's it. We'll see what kind of controversy this creates, but that's it for me, guys. Thanks, and I'll see you when I see you.